To great controversy in various quarters, but it was also awarded a prestigious French literary prize, the Prix des Critiques. And a lot of what I'm talking about today in relation to the text may show you why it was so controversial. Okay, so I'm not necessarily going to assume that you've read Le Baphomet, so hopefully my comments will be of interest to those who are familiar with the text as well as to those who are not familiar with the text. The book itself is a very singular work. It's, in terms of a lot of its style or setting, inspired by Walter Scott. So it's a Walter Scott-inspired tale about the Knights Templar. It's set, initially at least, at the beginning of the 14th century, just before the dissolution of the Templar Order at the behest of the French king, Philippe le Bel. 1307, all the Templars were arrested and incarcerated. So there's a historical prologue, and after that historical prologue, the action of the novel is transferred to a seemingly atemporal, non-historical sphere, populated by disembodied souls, the disembodied souls of the former Knights Templar. And they're just hanging around being souls, awaiting the last judgment. So there's a whole Christian eschatology that runs through this text. They're waiting for that moment when, after the last judgment, they may be reunited with their earthly bodies. So the setting, tone, and style of the novel are at first Gothic, but then the disembodied spirit of St. Teresa of Avila turns up, and Baroque elements start to dominate. And they mix with evocations of Masonic and esoteric ritual, Gnostic heresy, and theological, but also philosophical discussion. These are accompanied by the appearance of the French king who arrested the Knights Templar, Philippe le Bel, but also the figure of Friedrich Nietzsche, named the Antichrist, who appears somewhat bizarrely in the form of an anteater initially. So it has an unorthodox, archaic vocabulary and syntax, and after this initial historical prologue, it has a discontinuous and fantastical narrative presentation, in which the boundaries between identities and persons appear impermeable and insecure. And because of this, Le Baphomet really is a textual or a narrative experience which can be both baffling and obscure. And any of you who've tried to read the text will, if it's anything like my initial take on it, will have walked away feeling quite baffled. And it's a work which can also appear to lack any really intellectual or formal coherence. It's one whose multiplicity and evident complexity seem to promise rich possibilities of philosophical and literary interpretation, but whose narrative disorder and stylistic singularity can ultimately leave the reader very frustrated and with a sense of having been exposed to a kind of a literary mess. And any of you who've read Klossowski's philosophical works, particularly Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, will know he's not an easy read. He's a difficult writer, and a lot of the difficulty is tied up in the syntax of his writing. And I want to focus on the idea of writing and syntax to try and investigate his relationship with Nietzsche here today. And what I'm going to really argue is that in the Baphomet, although some degree of aesthetic coherence and purposiveness can be discerned within the text, any such coherence that there is ultimately at the very same time works to suspend the very principle of coherence. Perhaps more particularly, it suspends any horizon of unity or totality in which any possibility of coherence can take place in the first instance. And this is all directly related to his reading of Nietzsche and the presence of Nietzsche in the novel. So my comments are going to be divided into three principal areas: looking at the narrative structure of the text, looking at its philosophical and theological argument, and then looking at its descriptive style. And I hope to sort of end with a sense of how this is a literary text is functioning philosophically, but how the philosophy is also functioning literarily, if you like. And it's that crossover between philosophy and literature that I'm really interested in Klossowski, and always have been. So, as I've already mentioned, the setting and archaic style of the prologue of this novel evoke a historical romance in the genre of Walter Scott, as do more specifically some of the names. Names such as Malvoisie, Bois Guibert, they're all borrowed from Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. The intrigue, which I won't go into any great detail because it's very, very complicated, but the intrigue of this historical prologue turns around the desire of one Valentine de Saint-Vie, who is the lady of a domain called Palancé, her desire to return Templar lands and buildings to her own estate. It's a kind of an intrigue around land and power and wealth. In 1307, as I've already mentioned, the king, Philippe le Bel, in what was probably one of the first mass arrests in history, secretly ordered the simultaneous capture of all the Knights Templar across France. Early in the morning, they all had the knock on the door, which is not bad for medieval coordination of timings. They were all arrested at the same time, and there were charges laid against them. Some of you may be familiar with this. Charges of homosexual practices, sodomitical practices, various heretical and esoteric practices, and eventually it all went to trial, and they were burned or otherwise sort of disposed of. So the prologue has this very, very convoluted intrigue which turns around various factors. It climaxes, and this is the only thing I need to mention, with the Lady of Palancé being captured, the unveiling and mutilation of her unexpectedly male genitalia, and the apparently accidental hanging of a young page boy called Ogier during the course of a bizarre esoteric ritual. I mention this because it will be important for what I'm going to say later. At the very end of the prologue, the commander of the Templar Order bricks up the tower in which all this stuff has been happening and leaves everyone inside there to die of starvation. So then we shift abruptly to this atemporal sphere. The main body of the novel is even more difficult to summarise because there's no plot as such, so I won't really try to. But I can describe it in terms of its narrative structure. It unfolds as different scenes with no particular linear narrative as such. There are a number of dialogues and encounters between various figures, principally between the disembodied soul of the head of the Templar Order, Jacques de Molay, the disembodied soul of Saint Teresa of Avila, but also dialogues with this young adolescent page who was hanged, who reappears in an uncorrupted physical body, bizarrely, not quite clear why, and the eponymous Baphomet, the Baphomet of the title, about whom I shall say more in due course. Now, all these scenes recall the historical past of the Templar Order, which provides the setting for the prologue. The arrest and torture of all the knights is regularly alluded to, as are the torture and execution of the Grand Master himself, but also this hanging body of the adolescent, the eternal adolescent becomes a strong motif in all of late Klossowski's work, and if you're interested we can talk a bit about that later. But the central event around which this disordered, discontinuous narrative is ordered is the commemoration by all the disembodied souls of the Knights Templar of the execution of the Grand Master and the dissolution of the Order. And this is reenacted and repeated every sort of yearly cycle in this apparently atemporal sphere. They try and sort of grasp onto a sense of years and temporal calendar chronology when it clearly doesn't actually really exist. So this reenactment itself continually repeats itself during this space or this time where the spirits, Klossowski calls them in French souffle, meaning breaths or whispers. They're awaiting the time when they'll be reunited with their earthly bodies. So it's in this later scene of reenactment of this commemoration that the king, Philippe le Bel, appears, and Frederick the Antichrist, Nietzsche, in the guise of an anteater, makes its appearance. So far maybe so baffling. It really is, as I've characterised it, quite strange. But the point to note here really is that the greater part of this novel unfolds within the suspension of historical time and under the sign of repetition, the infinite echoing of historical events and individuals within eternity. The motif of repetition here implies not only the suspension of historical time, but also the doubling of elements from the historical prologue, but also elements from elsewhere in Klossowski's written work, his novelistic work in particular. Perhaps, interestingly for my argument and my purposes, it implies the notion of performance, the word repetition, implies the notion of performance, staging, or rehearsal. In French, répétition means a rehearsal, a theatrical rehearsal, as well as repetition in the sense that we might be familiar with. So the narrative of Le Baphomet may be discontinuous and confusing, but it's consistently scenic and performative in nature. The gestures of the souffle, the various figures, the rituals they engage in, suggests at times the unfolding of a stage spectacle, at other times the immobility of a frozen tableau. So while the whole of the work appears discontinuous, ruptured, without linear progression, and really rather arbitrarily formless or incoherent, it isn't quite as formless and incoherent as one might initially think, or as the discontinuity of it might suggest. Perhaps more precisely, if it is seemingly chaotic, this is because in the suspension of historical linear time, a logic of repetition prevails, a logic which exceeds any logic of linear progression or temporal continuity. And it's this interruption of historical temporality in which the mise en scène of disembodied souls unfolds, which creates a narrative or dramatic space in which a metaphysical set of arguments and debates are put forth within the text. And this metaphysical argument turns around what I'm talking about in this paper, the principles of unity, multiplicity, identity, and non-identity. And they're kind of pitted against each other in a kind of a head-to-head of theological and philosophical argument. And it turns around the status and fate of disembodied souls, but clearly Klossowski is using this dramatic situation in order to broach other kind of philosophical concerns, or perform them, I would say. So, here's the theological and philosophical argument. The argument, such as it is presented within the context of a double suspension. The motif of suspension is a figure that runs throughout the novel and is quite dominant. Suspension in the sense that the adolescent body is suspended and hanging and sort of rotating eternally. There's an image of suspension there, but also suspension in the sense of interruption and hiatus and breaking of continuity. In relation to the theological and philosophical argument, it's the suspension of divine judgment or law. It's also the suspension of individual identity and propriety. There's a sense that once the soul or the souffle becomes removed from the body and its bodily encasement, its identity is somehow compromised. And I'll talk more about this as I go on. The principal protagonists in this theological or metaphysical argument are Jacques de Molay, head of the Temple Order, the Saint Teresa, the Baphomet himself, and Friedrich Nietzsche. They all enter into all sorts of wonderful dialogues with each other. So, this suspension of historical time sits the disembodied souls, the souffle of the Templar Knights, in an interval or hiatus between their life on earth and the time of the Last Judgment. So this is how the Christian eschatology really frames the whole narrative. The souffle are suspended in a prolonged expectation of the moment when their earthly deeds will be weighed in the balance and their souls will, if it's found in their favour, eventually be reunited with their bodies and transported up into heaven, eternal life, and all the things that Christian eschatology promises for the saved. The Grand Master of the Templar Order, Jacques de Molay, stands within this drama as the guardian of divine law, the propriety of morality, and the right road to salvation. His self-imposed task is that to keep the souls of the brother knights on the course of rectitude, to prevent them falling back into the sinful, heretical practices that they engaged with during their lives, and succumbing to all the moral turpitude which they were accused of, and Klossowski seems to imply that they engaged in. So Jacques de Molay is the representative of theological unity, the principle of theological unity, and divine authority. And the demand here is that these Sufis remain self-identical in their moment of awaiting reuniting with their body. And this is staging all the concerns that anyone familiar with Klossowski's work will know run throughout the whole of his thinking. The vicissitudes of identity, the instability of identity, and the non-self-sameness of identity. This principle that the Grand Master seeks to hold up is immediately contested with the arrival of the spirit of Saint Teresa of Avila, and she announces at the beginning of the non-historical sequence the following, I quote, "The time has come to warn you that the ranks of the elect are closed." So the numbers of those who are going to be saved on Judgment Day appears determined in advance. And this is, various strands of Christian doctrine, heretical doctrine, perhaps not necessarily heretical doctrine, sometimes suggests that the number of the saved has always been fixed in advance, and there's sort of determinism there in certain strands of Christian theology. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them. The implications of this are drawn out in this text. Since the number of those who are going to be saved on Judgment Day have already been fixed, Teresa warns, these remaining souls, the ones that are populating our narrative, undergo a profound change in their substance or being. Another quote, "Henceforth humankind has changed in substance, it can no more be damned than saved." And what this amounts to in this space, this narrative metaphysical space, is a permanent interruption of any principle of divine unity or authority, the principle defended by the Grand Master. The time when the souls of the former knights will make their appearance before God is deferred infinitely. That interval or hiatus in which any expectation of salvation can occur becomes an eternity and an infinite deferral of that moment of judgment and any hope of reuniting body and soul. So with this interruption of divine presence and authority, the entire order of theological judgment and value is overturned within this narrative space. The deeds of life, of their former lives and their intentions, all these disembodied souls, all the things that they have to grab onto and hope to be valued with in the future, are no longer applicable. They're neither sanctifiable nor damnable. They're now beyond any sense of good and evil. There's a clear Nietzschean sort of motif already at work here. So we have a suspension of the theological principle of unity and divine presence. The suspension of any possibility of maintaining identity and propriety within the space of disembodied souls. So the principle of identity, which would otherwise have been fragile at best, is attempted to be maintained by these souls by recalling memories, their former lives, their acts, their intentions, etc. But we find in this infinite space of deferral and infinite distension of any possibility of unity that there are moments of memory and forgetting. And this resonates with various motifs in Klossowski's Vicious Circle book. And he's kind of staging philosophically things that he would otherwise say in his literary philosophical essayistic work. So, as this interval separating lived life from the day of judgment distends into infinity, the identity of the soul, any path back to its body, a body which would be proper to it, any sense of the body proper, which is a big motif in the wider French philosophical field that Klossowski is working in, is overturned. These Sufis are intentions, but intentions of the moment, moments of intensity, which without identity or propriety become exchangeable one with the other, which is why we get the sense of blurring of identities and intensities coming and going. And this will be evoked later in his work on Nietzsche. The suspended temporality of the Baphomet creates then a dramatic space in which these identities are struck by the principle of arbitrariness, and where they become intensive, intentional states which interpenetrate each other and become infinitely exchangeable. Jacques de Molay, the guardian of the law, of identity and propriety, is a vain defender of memory, of past deeds and intentions. Saint Teresa emerges across a number of fairly complex exchanges as a soul who seeks the oblivion of forgetting. She's seeking to merge her own identity with the massed intensities, intentions and souls of others. So we've got a theological drama here in which unity and multiplicity, identity and non-identity, memory and forgetting are all staged as opposed principles. This is woven through with various heretical doctrines evoked in the text. For instance, the Docetic heresy, which maintained that Christ was never incarnate and never came down to earth properly and fully, and other Gnostic and dualist-inspired doctrines, such as the belief that a number of souls can inhabit one body. They're all invoked within this theological drama. And then there's the Baphomet and Friedrich Nietzsche. The figure of the Baphomet, as Klossowski points out in a letter to a friend, has diverse origins. It's mentioned actually in the minutes of the trial of the Knights Templar. The Baphomet was said to be made of a head of gold, containing within it the skull of a virgin. And it was made, allegedly according to the minutes of the trial of the Templar Order, into a subject of a secret and idolatrous worship by the Knights Templar. It also appears, I think it's a Normandy church in Saint-Méry. There's a figure on one of the arches of the church doors where it appears. It has a multiple sort of origin. Klossowski himself indicates that the Baphomet of his novel is a coded form of Basilius Philosophorum Metallicorum, the sovereign of metallurgists and alchemists. And their beliefs were supposed to have taken root in the Templar Order. This was another one of the accusations that was charged against them. So it has a number of connotations. It connotes esoteric ritual and heretical doctrine. It connotes androgyny and alchemical transformation. And this is what gives the other name to the Baphomet, which is ascribed to it in the novel, the Prince of Modifications. The Prince of Modifications. So the figure of the Baphomet embodies a principle of metamorphosis, transmutation and transformation, a principle that absorbs all discrete identities and proclaims the permeability of all boundaries between self and other, or all limits of thought and being per se. The Baphomet, in a sense, would be the opposite of God, where the Christian God guarantees the identity of the soul, the unity of being. The Prince of Modifications overturns all identity and absorbs being into a principle of radical multiplicity. So, again, we're staging these opposites. The stability of form against the infinite plurality and mutability of the formless. They're opposed to each other in the text. And the Baphomet represents the infinite absorption of the first term into the second, or the suspension of the former in favour of the latter. And if the Baphomet is arguably the subversive double of the Father, then Nietzsche, the Antichrist, is not surprisingly the double of the Son. He's initially mistaken in the text for Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, who historically was also known as the Antichrist in his day. But Nietzsche's appearance as an anteater is baffling. Never quite got to the bottom of it. I'm open to suggestions for any of you who may have any thoughts. But his presence signals most explicitly the philosophical argument of the novel. And it's a philosophical argument that really underpins the dramatic structure and the situation as I've been outlining it to you. It's an argument, or an affirmation at least, which is drawn from Also sprach Zarathustra. And the anteater cites in a cavernous voice. It's actually a slight mis-citation from Zarathustra, but Klossowski gives it as follows. When the one God proclaimed himself to be unique, all the other gods died of laughter. Great moment. The presence of Nietzsche here, the allusion to Zarathustra, allows the philosophical dimension of Le Baphomet to resonate most fully, I think. Again, what's at stake here is unity versus multiplicity, the suspension of the first term in favour of the latter. And really the understanding of being as becoming or eternal flux. None of this will be surprising to us, I don't think. It's a staging of Klossowski's interpretation of the doctrine of eternal return. I will gloss very sort of roughly, I'm sure it will be done much better later in the day, how Klossowski reads Nietzsche's eternal return. And this is drawn mostly from the polytheism and parody essay of the late 1950s. Klossowski reads the doctrine as a doctrine in which each moment or instant of existence is seen to repeat itself infinitely in an unending cycle without beginning or end, origin or goal. This won't be surprising to us, but with the effect of modifying our apprehension of being. Any moment or instant within the cycle of being cannot, in this reading of return, be subordinated to anything outside of itself, to any linear or teleological principle, to any form of transcendental synthesis, of identity, or overarching unity, since as moment or incident, it only exists as infinite repetition of a singular point of intensity, irreducible to any horizon of totality. So this is multiplicity, fragmentary multiplicity, in excess of or outside of any figure of unity, figure of the one, of horizon, irrecoupable and irreducible to it. Again, it's a concept we might be familiar with, but very problematic, and this is the way Klossowski approaches this problem, through the doctrine of eternal return. It's the infinite return of the singular, in excess of or outside of any logic of the same. So the doctrine of return here emerges within this theological and metaphysical debate in Le Baphomet, as it does in Nietzsche, an inevitable outcome of the death of God. There's a kind of necessary fiction which allows us to apprehend being as infinite, non-self-identical multiplicity. The antithesis is affirmation, when the one God proclaimed himself unique, all the other gods died of laughter, is a condensed or aphoristic apparition of the consequences of the death of God. This then is a philosophical allusion to an affirmation which is staged in a very sort of reduced sense of the way Klossowski is reading Nietzsche here. Because what I'm interested in, the way this is staged in the literary text. It's staged through, as I've discussed, the suspension of historical time, the infinite delay of the day of judgment, the permeability of the non-self-identity of disembodied souls, or souffle, but also in the various evocations of Gnostic heresy. All these moments stage a dispersal of the principle of unity and of the fixity of substance. It's dispersed into a repetition of multiplicity and the flux of becoming. And yet this is the crucial point. It's not just that these instances are a mise-en-scène or dramatic interpretation of the doctrine of eternal return, which we may be very well familiar with. And Maurice Blanchot, in his essay on Le Baphomet, suggests that this is really just a literary staging of the doctrine of return. Rather, I would say that the invocation of Zarathustra and the doctrine of return, like all these other textual and narrative moments I've been talking about, is presented within a textual mechanism, if you like, which enacts or performs this dispersal of unity into multiplicity, of substance into flux. So the actual textual, narrative and literary fabric of Le Baphomet is an aesthetic form which is adequate to the dispersal of multiplicity and a thinking or a form which is beyond unity. And I will show you, I will try and sort of finish by saying why this is so. And this is where we come to the descriptive style of Le Baphomet and its performative status, if you like. A performance of thought, of form, where an infinite distance from any figure of unity, of divine law or authority is not just described but staged. And in this there is an affirmation of something beyond any monological or unitary ground of being. This is most evident in Klossowski's rather playful and unorthodox syntax. And throughout Klossowski's writing, really the syntax of his French, it's often Latinate and often all sorts of other things as well. It's very curious and quite hard to get one's head around. So I've talked from the outset that the vocabulary and syntax of Le Baphomet are archaic. He uses, very controversially, I won't go into the big controversy that grew up around this, but he uses phrases in French such as car en effet, meaning for in effect. It's a curious instance which one of the judges on the jury that gave Klossowski the prize for this novel, he resigned from the jury in outrage that they wanted to give Klossowski this prize. And he wrote to Le Monde and said, "This is why I've resigned from the jury. This guy can't write French. It's bad French. It's a terrible, mystical, pederastical load of nonsense," is how he described this novel. So there's a big controversy, and I've written about this elsewhere, and I won't go into it. But so he particularly disliked the use of the phrase "car en effet," and later, as a member of the Académie Française, he got them to sort of put down in writing that this was not good in modern French. You shouldn't use it. So this is Roger Caillois being his bonnet about it. He knew Klossowski in the 30s, and I don't think he liked him then. So there's a long feud going on. So you've got "car en effet." You have other terms in French such as "nonobstant," meaning in spite of, and it dates from the 13th century. Juvenceau, word for youth, dating from the 15th century. Monial, meaning none, from the 12th century. Stupre, rape, shameful debauchery, from the 14th century. Just a few examples, they're all over the place. Very archaic, not just from any one medieval period, but from lots of different periods, which I'll talk about in a minute. As an example of the archaic syntax of the piece, one could note that the adjectives always tend to appear before the noun, and not, as they most often do in modern French, after them. Not always, but most often. The syntactical and lexical chaos of the piece can border on the absurd, and certainly was judged by Caillois to be just really bad writing. But it also has ridiculous and quite comic effects. To say that the work is comic as a whole is probably stretching it. It's a bit excessive. But if its linguistic and descriptive style don't provoke laughter, they are arguably written under the form or the sign of laughter. The sign of what Blanchot calls serious hilarity. And this is the laughter of the gods, always many, always erupting into hilarity at the very thought of a single or unique god. The narrative of Le Baphomet is dramatic structure, the theoretical and philosophical argument that I summarised earlier, its linguistic, that stylistic texture, all work to form a fictional metaphysical space of writing in which the divine laughter of the many gods overwhelms the divine law of any one god who would proclaim himself unique. It's in this sense less the case that the principles of unity and multiplicity, identity and non-identity, memory and forgetting are opposed to each other in the Baphomet. The text stages an initial opposition, or apparent opposition, of all these terms. Yet these moments are opposed to each other in appearance only, since the first term of each of the oppositions, identity, divine law, linear time of Christian eschatology, is suspended within the narrative and, if you like, absorbed into the logic of the second term. It's this decisive suspension of a theological and monological principle in the texture of writing that I think is really my crucial point today. It's a suspension which was articulated systematically at the level of syntax and lexis. The use of Latinate, early modern syntax, together with archaic vocabulary from all the different epochs I mentioned earlier, represents not just a gratuitous flouting of modern French grammar, but a rigorous undermining of its identity and unity. The system or structure of the form of modern French is, if you like, unable to maintain its integrity and coherence. It's overwhelmed by the multiplicity of past forms of the language as the novel shifts from a Latinate style into one of preciosity, as it shifts between different syntactical and lexical usages dating from different centuries. The metaphysical space of the novel in which the Day of Judgment is infinitely deferred and identity suspended, is also a narrative space in which linguistic form is exposed to a principle of radical heterogeneity, which exceeds the closure of any synchronic form of French, any one synchronic form of French. In this sense, the language of the Baphomet contests the principles of unity and identity in the very same way as do its narrative structure and theological philosophical argument. Language here is really analogous to the status of the souffle themselves, the disembodied souls. The boundaries which separate the modern form of French from earlier forms, from its Latin root, are all permeable and insecure. Like the souffle, the French language in the Baphomet echoes its temporal and historical existence in an eternity of repetition. And so, like the souffle, it exists without self-identity. It exists, I quote from the text itself, as an infinite and apparently gratuitous diversity of shapes. A diversity which implies also the infinite diversion of any judgment of value. The suspension here of theological but also ontological unity is maintained on the level of philosophical affirmation, certainly, but most crucially on the level of presentation and aesthetic form. So the formal heterogeneity of the novel, such as it is, manifested in the structure, the prose style, all these things I've been talking about, emerges perhaps less as a kind of chaotic mess or writerly incompetence, this is what Benoit attributed to the text, and far more systematically as a performative gesture. It's a performance which really performs an irreducibly fragmentary multiplicity, irreducible to unity. It shows you that this multiplicity inhabits any figure of unity, or it absorbs any gesture of unity into itself. It's a multiplicity in which any attempt of one God to name itself as the unique God is overturned in this laughter of writing as a form of laughter. So, I'll draw to a close and conclude. What I want to underline here is that this is not a transgression of unity in which the law of the one is broken in order to be all the better affirmed by the primordiality and integrity of that very law. Rather, this is a gesture which suggests that while the law of the one will always necessarily seek to maintain itself as a totality and as a unity, it will always necessarily, always already if you like, be contested from within by the prior existence of infinite and infinitely indeterminable multiplicity, by the impropriety and infinite plurality of mutable existence. The many gods will always explode into divine laughter when the one God proclaims himself to be unique. The Baphomet needs to be seen first and foremost as a metaphysical fable, a fable of multiplicity, but a fable which stages and performs this impropriety and infinite multiplicity in writing itself. It can be read as a mise en abîme of literary space and of writing in general. Writing which always in some way exists at the limits of historical time, outside of or as a break from historical time. Klossowski, I think, comes quite close to Blanchot and a Blanchotian conception of writing here. But he's always, having once trained as a monk and as a seminarist, always interested in putting this in relation to sort of Christian doctrines and theological doctrines. So, as a fabulous literary presentation of infinite multiplicity, Le Baphomet is also, I think, an affirmation of writing and of a paradigm of writing which will always exceed any possibility of full coherence and unity. It's a paradigm which suggests a modification of the unitary ground upon which thought and value, being, ontology can ever be placed. It's a modification which is revealed in and through writing. And my sense is if we approach Klossowski and the Baphomet and the writings on Nietzsche generally as philosophers, we shouldn't forget that one of the key ways he's contributed to the reading of Nietzsche, but also to our sense of the relation between literature and philosophy, is to be one of those key figures in the French tradition who's reminded us that thought is always a matter of writing, of figuration and form, rather than of concept. And if we, I think, approach him in that way, I think we can approach Klossowski's writing not just as philosophical propositions about Nietzsche, but always as a kind of performance, a performance of writing what he comes in the Nietzsche text to call an impulsional semiotic, one which is always traversed by echoes of divine laughter. And here the ground of thought itself is suspended and opens onto an excess, an infinite and ungraspable multiplicity of being. Thank you.